Hello and welcome to the Home Mastering Q&A live stream. I'm just going to get myself a coffee while other people arrive. Please drop me a comment somewhere so that I know you can hear me, and I'll be right back. Okay, you can hear me. Sorry about that. Highly unprofessional start. Never mind. Okay, next thing to do is check that Facebook is working. Yep, I can see my empty room, so that's cool. Okay, Kev, hi. Pablo, thanks for being here. Dan, okay. I can see more questions coming in. So I have a bunch of questions already that people have asked me to answer. So I will start with those, but feel free to add your questions in the comments on Facebook or YouTube if you would like, and I will get through as many as I can. But there's a ton, so I don't know how many that will be. Let's have a slurp of coffee. And before we start, if you're watching this and think people you know would like it or enjoy it or find it useful, please share it somewhere and let people know that it's happening, so as many people as possible can see what we're doing. So I thought I would start. There was a few kind of questions. Well, for example, there was one from Ibrahim who said, is there a formula on which everyone can follow during mastering? Step-by-step examples like starting with noise reduction, equalization, compression, add reverb, and that kind of thing. And one from Dave saying, what are the basic requirements for streaming? I'm a newbie at this. And one from Daniel saying, how do you calibrate a monitoring setup for mastering? What characteristics do you look for in a room to be mastering worthy? So those questions alone could take an entire hour-long live stream. So I'm not going to try and attempt to answer all of those because I have kind of already done that. If you search for Mastering Essentials, you'll find a link on the Sound on Sound website. In fact, I'll do it now and drop it in the comments. It's a series of 6 videos that I did for Sound on Sound magazine, where I go through what I consider to be the fundamentals of mastering. Here's the link. I will paste that in the chat now. And I'll add it to the posts after the stream has finished. So yeah, I can briefly kind of give you an idea. In terms of I've lost my questions window now. There's no formula, Ibrahim, but I work in a particular way, typically. So yes, I do things like restoration, denoising, declicking, removing buzz, hum, all that kind of stuff, if necessary, on the raw file, because any other processing you do can actually make it harder to fix those things. Then I adjust the level first, so I get the loudness right first, beginning with just a limiter to catch the peaks, and then moving into compression. We'll come back to that topic in a little bit. Then I will add some equalization, because you can't hear EQ accurately unless you have got the loudness right first, and then I start thinking about dynamics processing, so more active use of compression, heavier limiting, clipping, saturation, that kind of thing. So those are the fundamentals for me: level, EQ, compression, limiting. The trick is that all of them influence each other. If you change the level, it changes the way the EQ sounds. If you change the EQ, it changes the way that the level sounds. If you change the compression and the limiting, it changes the way the level sounds, and therefore also changes the way the EQ sounds. So they all interact. But I find that sequence, get the level right, then the EQ, then the dynamics, will give you the most reliable results. And also it allows you to be as minimal as possible. In mastering, I want the lightest touch possible. I don't want to stamp a signature sound on anything. I just want to enhance what I'm given and get it closer, if possible, to what the artist and engineer originally imagined. So, and when you adjust the loudness first, maybe it sounds perfect, just adjusting the loudness, and that's all you have to do. If you then do an EQ tweak, maybe then it sounds perfect without any dynamics processing. So that sequence, that approach encourages minimalism, which is why I recommend it. So anyway, in the Mastering Essentials videos on the Sound on Sound site, I walk you through that entire process. And I also talk about things at the end. I talk about basic streaming requirements, Dave. I mean, you know, the good news is that these days, because of loudness normalization, which I'll talk about in another question, loudness is less of a concern these days with streaming. So providing your file is in the ballpark of -14 LUFS or higher, you should be fine in terms of what happens to the loudness. Keep your peaks below -1, I would say, and then you want to upload a lossless format, you know, WAV, AIFF. Lots of streaming services are starting to accept high-res formats, high-spec formats, I should say. I used to, in the videos you'll see, I recommend sticking with 4416. I think now, in the last few months, we maybe have got a tipping point where it's going to become feasible to start submitting high-spec files to all of the streaming services, as well as just Apple, for example. But I'm not 100% convinced on that, but soon that's going to be fine. So the kind of the requirements are pretty minimal, but the devil is always in the details, and there are a lot of devils and details in streaming. So I'll probably come back to that in more detail. But again, I talk about that in these videos that I did for Sound on Sound. Calibrating a room for mastering, what makes a room mastering worthy? That's a really tough question, because I have been in some mastering rooms that were not worthy, and I've been in some rooms that were not mastering rooms that maybe were worthy. I think, you know, as a minimum, you need really good monitoring. You need at least some acoustic treatment. You can see some in the back of my room here. It needs to be a decent size. You know, the smaller it is, the more shaped like a cube it is, the harder it is to get it sounding good, the more problems you're going to have. But then there are people who master on headphones, you know, and very successfully, you know, pro engineers who work exclusively on headphones. So there's no one answer to that, you know, and there are some pro designed mastering rooms, certainly recording studios, where the acoustics are not fantastic at all. They're not remotely optimal. The better the room, the better the monitoring, the better the gear, the easier the job gets. The faster you can work, the more efficient, the more enjoyable it is. But the minimum threshold, I mean, this is the other thing, is that gear and, I mean, speakers are so much better these days than back when I started mastering. The first mastering room I worked in, the speakers alone were £20,000 without thinking about the room or the acoustic treatment or the gear. These days, you really can get monitors for a few thousand, maybe even a few £100 that are very, very good. I'm not going to say they're mastering standard in the sense of what you would find in a professional mastering studio, but if you understand the information they're giving to you and you're careful, and maybe you couple them with a set of headphones to let you hear the bass without any possible confusion from the room, it's one of my mottos is that mastering is simple, but it's not easy. You know, EQ, compression, limiting, simple, but not easy to get right. And the same applies to setting up a mastering room and all the rest of it. But there's some discussion about all of that and how I like to set up my monitoring for mastering in those sound on sound videos, which I dropped the link to in the comments if you have only just arrived on the stream. And also there are other resources. So there is a series of posts. This is my home mastering studio. It's not a proper mastering studio. It's just a room that I set up at home that would enable me to kind of listen and do some work. It turned out far better than I ever thought it would. And I made some videos, this is years ago now, about how I set it up. And I can share the link for that with you as well. Okay, so this is, oh, that's the YouTube link. Just a second. There we go. I'll share the final section with you. Yeah, these videos are old now, but they give you an idea of what I did to set up a very workable room at home. This room sounds way better than it has any right to be honest. Let's post that there. Oh wow, lots more questions coming in. Okay, so I should move on. But yeah, hopefully those links, sound on sound videos, and that one about setting up this room at home will give you some useful feedback on those kind of questions. There's one more about monitoring here from Dan, which is interesting. He says, if you have a fixed budget for monitoring, would you recommend spending the whole thing on mains, or would you recommend using some of it to buy a sub? I'm asking because if I spent, say, £1,000 on a sub, that's a fair chunk to take off the monitors if you're buying mid-priced ones. And absolutely. My personal opinion is probably to go for a full range set of monitors, simply because setting up a sub properly, I mean, firstly, you say a sub, but I think most mastering facilities would say if you're going to use subs, you need two. I know the whole argument about mono bass and all the rest of it. You can get good results with a single sub, but most mastering studios are going to recommend you have two. If you can get a speaker that has decent low frequency coverage, you know, that goes down to 30 Hertz, maybe not flat, but at least reliably with no major lumps and bumps, I think you've got a better chance of setting those up in a room and getting them to sound good than setting up a sub without specialist help. You know, I've set up subs in my time. Am I convinced I got it perfectly right? I'm not sure. There's all kinds of information out there. Anyway, so I mean, short answer, personally, I think a really good set of monitors that covers as wide a frequency range as possible in terms of bass extension would be my preference. But there are lots of other people out there who would disagree with that. So, you know, I mean, there's a saying somewhere, which is, you know, ask a recording engineer or a sound engineer what the best XYZ is, and they'll tell you what they're using. Because we all know, you know, we all come up with solutions that work for us. And therefore, you know, I can tell you, I can recommend to you, oh, you could use this or that plugin because I've used it and I know that it works. That doesn't mean it's the best, you know, there's preference that comes into it, all the rest of it. So yeah, but I do think setting up a sub is tough to get right. You know, because it also interacts with the room, and it will interact in a different way to the main monitors. You've got to get the crossovers right. You've got to get the power handling right. There's a lot more moving parts, I would say, especially if you're in the budget where if you're considering spending £1,000 on a sub, then you're obviously considering spending a decent chunk of money on the monitors. And once you get into the, you know, £5,000-6,000 region, which is what, $8,000-10,000, you know, you can get some seriously good main monitors for that with some really good bass extension. You know, again, I'm not going to say that it's the equivalent of what Bob Ludwig has in his mastering room, you know, or the best facilities in the world, but really good and definitely good enough to do great work with. Now, there's a question here from Paul, which is kind of very common, and he's not going to like my answer. He says, so I turn my mix that is peaking at -6 up until it's about to clip. I decide I want more loudness, so I bring in a limiter. Where do I set my thresholds? The output ceiling is a separate control, in is at -1. I've been setting thresholds of about -2.5 with 1 or 2 dB of gain reduction. I've got it averaging about -11 LUFS. I mean, I think one thing that I would say, Paul, is if you're happy with the way that it sounds, I think you're good to go. The loudest stuff that I master, me personally, and of course, anybody watching this, if you don't already know, I'm not a fan of extreme loudness. I don't do it. I don't enjoy it. I don't like the way that it sounds. So I'm not the best person to ask about it. But for me, the loudest stuff that I master is maybe -10 LUFS, and that's for a song that's loud all the way through. So -11, you're in the right ballpark, in my opinion. If you want to go louder, you're going to have to use more limiting, but I would be careful about that. I always recommend using a combination of compression and limiting. Share the load. So what I say is, limiting is great at controlling transients and brief peaks, but it's much too aggressive for controlling the body of the sound, the musical content of the sound. So drum transients, guitar strums, vocal clicks, all that kind of stuff. Yes, limiting. Beautiful, clean, invisible, what we're looking for. Cutting into a vocal or a bass or, the body of a drum sound, almost certainly not, unless you're going for an extreme limited sound, maybe EDM drum sound or something. You're unlikely to get what you want. Whereas compressors are terrible at controlling transients, but they're great at controlling the body of the sound. So I tend to have compressors with quite slow attack times, quite slow release times. Those control the music, if you like, the vocals, bass, all that kind of stuff. And then I have a really clean digital limiter at the end of the chain to control the peaks, because those are just going to go straight through the compressor without being affected. So combination of those two things, I think, is going to enable you to get the best possible result. How much and where you should set your threshold depends completely on the material. As I say, Paul, those numbers that you mentioned, I think you're in the right ballpark. But if you want to go louder, you're going to have to push things harder. And that's where it gets challenging. Hopefully that helps. I talk about this stuff more in the Mastering Essentials video, the Sound on Sound videos as well. And there's all kinds of posts on my website at productionadvice.co.uk. Since I'm mentioning a URL, I will just pause and say that the reason that I'm doing this Q&A is because my home mastering masterclass starts this Friday. It's an 8-week online course. Every week I master a different song using a different DAW, using different strategies, solving different problems. There are interviews with the people who supplied the songs. There's a Facebook group where you can connect with other people on the course and ask questions. And you can send in questions, and I run Q&A sessions exactly like this one, except you get to talk to me specifically about your questions and ask follow-ups. So if you're interested in that, head over to homemastering.com. There is a discount this week. You can get £90 off, which, especially if you go for the Max bundle, that includes 2 other things that I do, works as a really good saving. So plug over. If you enjoy this Q&A and would like more, you would love the Home Mastering Masterclass, head over, take a look, see what you think. Okay, I'm going to pause on the questions that were supplied before and just see what kind of comments are coming in from you guys who are here, because you're watching. So thank you. So I will try and answer your questions. Let's scroll back up. People saying hello. Arturo says, loudness differences between parts of a song. How do you know if it's too much? When it sounds wrong. But seriously, I tend to work when I'm mastering, I tend to focus first on the loudest sections of the song. If you focus on the quiet sections, the danger is that when you get to the loud sections, they'll be too loud. They'll be pushing the dynamics too hard, or they'll distort or something. You'll be unhappy with the way they sound, and it's less efficient. So I listen to, I tend to, when I first get songs in for an album, I tend to skip around and just get an idea of the variety of content there. Some people listen all the way through to an album. I don't do that, but then I usually I start at the beginning, or I might start with the most intense song if there's a real variety of material, and I listen to that all the way through, and I make my settings. And by the way, lots of people think that mastering is a single setting you apply to an entire album or an entire group of songs. That is not the case. Individual settings for every song is where the magic happens in mastering. You optimize each song on its own merits, just like you optimize every track in a mix or every channel in a mix. And that's where the real benefits come. But yeah, you start with the first song, and I tend to, I'll be listening through to it and it'll get to the loud section, and then very often I'll focus in on that loud section, and I might loop around and around and around working on it. When I'm happy with that, then I'll typically go back to the beginning and run it again. And it may be that at that point everything sounds fine, or I just tweak a few little things and I double check with the loud section, all sounds good, give it a listen through, job done, I move on to the next song. But sometimes things don't feel right. You've had the loud section pumping out, feeling great, then you go back to the beginning, you think, actually that's lost some energy, or it just feels too muted or far back, or maybe the opposite, maybe it's too loud. So then I start using automation to just gently, now that might sound like sacrilege because I'm changing the mix decisions, except I'm not, because all of these decisions are made with the mastering processing in place. And once you've got mastering, compression and EQ and everything else happening, it can change the way the mix feels. So it's very common for me to spend half an hour mastering the first song on an album and then get to the point where I want to compare it to the source, and I'm listening to it and going, well, apart from the loudness, they don't sound that much different. And I've done a ton of work to get something that sounded very similar to the source, but is much louder and much more controlled dynamically, because that's how I think it needs to sound. So I'm doing a lot of work to not change the sound very much. That's fine. If I hadn't done that, if I'd just taken the original mix and pushed it up into a limiter, it wouldn't sound nearly as good. There are other times when you really transform the song, so that's also a possibility. But just because your chorus sounds great with all of the mastering processing in place doesn't necessarily mean that when you go back to the verse, the balance will sound right anymore. So I'm quite happy to tweak that. You need to be clever with crossfades in terms of automation changes, so you put them in the right places so that people don't hear what you're doing. My goal is to be invisible. I want it to sound better, but I don't want anybody to know why. I don't want them to go, wow, listen to the mastering compression on that. I just want them to go, I love this song, and want to sing along or dance or laugh, cry, whatever it is, the goal of the music. But that means that sometimes automation is needed to get the balance right between the levels of the song. And really then I judge it on just how it feels, ad jure. But I would say, as a rule of thumb, probably you're looking at 3 or 4 dBs difference, maybe in LUFS or RMS, or however you're measuring the loudness between the verse and the chorus is probably kind of right. Something like Zanny by Billie Eilish has massive contrast between the verse and the chorus, I guess it's the verse and the chorus. More like 8 or 9 dBs. That's pretty extreme, and I would say that's quite brave. For me, I listen to that in the car and a noisy, and when it gets to the verse, I can hardly hear her. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying, that's a more unusual decision from my perspective. So those are the kinds of differences you might be looking at. 5 or 6, if it sounds great, is absolutely fine. If you want a more dramatic contrast, and sometimes you actually want the verse and chorus to be very similar. One of the tricks people play is to not have that much measured difference between the verse and the chorus, but they sound different. That's a whole topic in itself, the difference between measuring loud on a meter and sounding loud, giving the impression of loudness. If you record a distorted electric guitar and turn it way down, it's still going to sound like a loud sound. It's just at a low level, right? So it's not all about what, in fact, quite a lot, most of it is in the way that it sounds, not what it meters. But yeah, that's a whole other rabbit hole. I can't get into that, or I won't ask you any more questions. Let's scroll through some more of these. Kev, I have a question. I see when you master, you set your level to minus 10 VU and then you EQ balance, but what levels do you set as your threshold on your multiband compressor? So that completely depends, Kev, on the material. So I haven't mentioned VU meters. Everybody talks about loudness meters these days. I really like the traditional. I used to have actual VU meters with needles in them. These days I have a plugin that emulates them. There's a bunch of them out there. But yeah, I tend to set the 0, actually these days at -11. And then, so most of the time the needle is ticking around in the middle of the scale. And then for the loud sections pushes up maybe 2, occasionally 3 dBs above that. The reason I like the VU meter so much is partly because that's what I was trained to use. And I used one for 15 years. Before I left to set up my own mastering studio, and then I didn't have an actual VU meter, and then I found the plugin. I was like, oh, finally a plugin. But they're really sensitive in the middle of the scale. They go, which way around are you looking at this? They go from 0 down here, which is -30, not -90, which is on a digital scale, but -30, so not that much lower, up to 0 in the middle, and then +3. So that means if let's say for me, calibrated to -11, that means that the RMS and the LUFS and the VU readings for balanced EQ, they're all going to be similar. They're all going to be hovering around 0 most of the time. If I push the level just 2 or 3 dBs higher than that, the meters are going to peg. So it immediately tells me visually, I can hear it as well, but visually it tells me everything's too loud. In the same way, if you drop it down by 3 dBs, the needle the needle is back here, and any more than 3 dBs and it's drooping right down here. So it's really sensitive. So in terms of kind of getting yourself in the right ballpark, of course you should master and mix with your ears, not with your eyes. But especially when you're learning, having metering to give you feedback is super useful. So I do recommend it, particularly as a learning tool. I would never tell you to make a choice based on what the meters say over what your ears tell you, but they're a great sanity check. Excuse me. So yes, VU meters hovering around -11. Yeah, the threshold of what happens in the multiband. Actually, I tend to have some default settings on my compression, and I don't tend to mess with the thresholds that much. It's more about how hard I push the signal into those. There's no difference between, or there is a difference, but lowering the threshold on a compressor or pushing up the input gain will both trigger more compression. It's a matter of taste. It relates to the gear that I first used back in the days when I started mastering. The setup I was trained with, I had an input fader. You would push that up into the dynamics. Now, sometimes I do tweak the threshold, and much more often the ratio and all the rest of it. But it's more about, it's all about the relationship. If you have a threshold at -3, so here's 0, you have a threshold at -3, and your music's down here, it's never going to cross the threshold. Nothing's going to happen. So you could turn the threshold down so that the music starts hitting it and you get some compression, but then you'll have to increase the output gain, the makeup gain, or you can push up the input level so that it's pushing against the threshold. But it all depends, what is the material going in, how dynamic is it, how is it mixed, what arrangement decisions are made. So there absolutely are no numbers that I can give anybody for that stuff. White Sea is here. Hey, thanks for being here. If you guys haven't checked out White Sea's channel, just search for White Sea Studio on YouTube. He has some fantastic stuff there. Highly recommend him. The snake oil videos are always fun. There, Kev's saying hello to him, and loads of people saying hello to White Sea. Pangineer, good name. Do you think that you could benefit from ear training exercises for mixing or mastering, or are they sort of overkill and you learn enough in the process? If yes, what exercises can you recommend? My trouble with ear training exercises is that, I definitely think they could help. If it's so useful to be able to listen to something and know, oh, that's about 1K, or that's about 5K, or 70 Hertz, or whatever. It just makes everything easier and faster. But that is definitely something you can learn. I did not have that to begin with, and over the years I learned it, but I never did formal ear training exercises. But they would have helped. But the trouble is, quite often they're pretty tedious. So yeah, if you can stomach them, and you try them and you think they're going to be helpful, use ear training exercises. Why not? For me, I prefer to just play with music and kind of learn it over time. That's another example of when meters are super useful in the learning stage. You don't want anything too precise. If you have, like most EQs these days come with this insane frequency analysis, and it's so detailed that it can be confusing. In my home mastering EQ videos, which are part of the Max bundle with the Home Mastering Masterclass that starts this Friday, that you can get a discount on if you head over to homemastering.com now. In those videos, I suggest there's a Voxengo make a meter called Span, which gives you it's free and it gives you full frequency analysis. They have a mastering mode. There are some other tweaks that I suggest, but I actually think a much broader, gentler overall EQ shape is more helpful than getting obsessed about the difference between 80 or 90 hertz. General understanding of EQ regions is far more important than kind of sort of laser focus on this, that, and the other. So, but having that kind of feedback, especially when you start out, so that you hear a booming sound in the room and you think, oh, what's that? And you look at your meter and it's, oh, maybe that's it at 100. And you try taking a bit out at 100 and it might solve it or it might not. But over time, you'll start to learn how the EQ moves you make relate to the meters, relate to what you hear. And that's how your ear learns. That's how you train your ears. And yeah, if you find some ear training exercises that you like, definitely, why not go for it? Just catching up with the chat here. Don says, are room modes still a huge factor even in a mastering room? Yeah, absolutely. There is no such thing as a perfect room. Not even close. But what you can do is put in acoustic treatment, be careful with your monitor placement, get a good listening position, have the best monitors you can afford to manage all of that stuff. And you don't, the thing is, it doesn't matter. I mean, room acoustics need to be under control in a mastering studio, but I mean, this room is far from perfect, and I can, if I do some EQing in here, I can be pretty, well, I know that what I'm hearing is reliable, and therefore I know that what I do is going to be reliable. An untreated room could have peaks and nulls. You could have a point where 10 hertz difference, and you've got 12 dB or 24 dB of difference. That's almost impossible to hear through. It's so confusing when you listen to that you can't manage it. But if you put in some fairly simple acoustic treatment, you can reduce those differences to 6 or 8 dBs, much, much less. And even more importantly, you can reduce the reverb time of the room. So you're playing music full tilt and then you hit pause. How quickly does the sound in the room die down to zero? If it goes, if there's big kind of lag of all of that extra energy is still bouncing around the room all the time you're listening to everything else, cluttering up everything else you're hearing. If you can reduce that using acoustic treatment, even if the room frequency response is not perfectly flat, which it never will be, all of that stuff gets in the way of hearing the music accurately. So yeah, in a professional studio, you'll have acousticians going in and honing in on certain resonant frequencies that are booming or nulling in the room, and they'll put in tuned absorbers to mitigate those. In a room like this, you can have broadband absorption that can just generally smooth everything out and bring the response time of the room down. That was the point I was going to make. To some extent, it's useful because real rooms out in the world have that. I mean, I mentioned using headphones. You could use headphones and you take the room completely out of the equation. So the better your headphones, the more reliable the sound is. But then from headphones, you don't get that feel of being in a room. So you then have to learn to translate what you're hearing in your ears to how it's going to sound in a real room. Whereas if you're working with monitors in a real room, which is my preference, you have a sense of that. And it's always a balancing act of listening to what you're translating, what you hear in your room, understanding how that's going to translate into the outside world. And for me, it's all about getting the room and the listening environment as neutral as possible, so that if somebody listens to it on a pair of Beats with big booming bass, it'll sound the way that they expect. And if they listen to it on a pair of earbuds, it'll sound the way that they expect, and so on. So, yeah, room acoustics are a massive part of it, but they don't have to be perfect, just like everything else. I mean, the better it is, the easier it gets, the more fun it is, the more efficient you can be. But none of this stuff has to be perfect to do a decent job. Seth, thank you for the years of doing the podcast. My pleasure. If you like this stuff, head over to themastering.show.com. There's 80 episodes now of me rambling on about mastering with John Tidy for you guys to listen to. Can I ask you to explain LUFS 9 versus 18 and when to pay attention to momentary, short-term and integrated loudness? I'm not sure what you mean about 9 versus 18 there, Seth. Maybe you're talking about calibrating a VU meter. VU meters come calibrated to often calibrated to minus 18 VU, which is roughly RMS, which is roughly LUFS. But I wouldn't normally I'm not sure what you mean by LUFS 9. Maybe if you can drop another comment and I could come back to that. In terms of when to pay attention to momentary, short-term and integrated loudness gives you a good idea gives you a single number that gives you an idea of how loud a particular song is. So a song that's at minus 10 LUFS integrated is going to be louder typically than one that's at minus 20. But of course, within that, you can have a lot of variety, and that's where the short term comes into play. So you could have one that was at minus 12 and one that was minus 16, but they both have a similar loudest at the loudest moments in each of those songs, in which case the integrated value isn't telling you that. Whereas if you watch the short-term loudness, that would give you an idea of that. Personally, I don't use momentary loudness much at all. John, who mixes the Mastering Show podcast, uses it quite a lot on dialogue, but I don't do a ton of dialogue mastering. So I mostly watch the short-term loudness. That reminds me of a question we had that was submitted before the stream started. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, Tim asked, why do some tracks on Spotify sound louder than mine, even though Spotify normalize everything to minus 14 LUFS? And this is probably the most commonly asked question in mastering in general. So the first thing I should say is that LUFS is not perfect. It's pretty good. It's better than RMS. It's better than VU in terms of, the goal is to measure loudness and give us a number that corresponds with how loud we hear things as being. That's the goal for LUFS. LUFS is pretty good, but it's not perfect. But for stuff with a balanced EQ response, so what I would consider well mastered, I think it's really good. It typically agrees with my ears in terms of the short-term loudness. Comparing, if you make two things equal short-term loudness for a short section of the song, I think you've got a good chance they're going to sound equally loud. But integrated loudness is over the whole song. And so if you master every song on your album to be minus 14 LUFS, they're not going to sound right musically, because there's going to be some kind of variety. Well, they might sound right musically if they're all the same kind of thing. If it's all hard rock, or if it's all full-on EDM, or it's all vocal and acoustic, that might work. But if you've got a mixture of stuff, if you have a song that's loud all the way through, then the overall loudness will be high because the song is loud all the way through. But if you have a song that's loud for half of it and quieter for the other half, the integrated loudness, the overall loudness number, is going to come out somewhere in between those two, probably halfway. So the integrated number will be less. But the loud sections could be equal in both songs. It's easier if you think about a musical example. If you've got an indie pop album and it's got an acoustic ballad on there and it's got a thrashy guitar tune, you don't want a thrashy guitar tune and an acoustic guitar ballad to measure the same loudness, because they're musically very different. So if you master them both at -14 or any other number, they will come out sounding a similar loudness, and the acoustic one will sound too loud musically. The measured, the technical metered loudness is matched correctly, but musically they sound wrong. That's usually what's happening when people master their stuff to -14 and then it doesn't sound the way they expect on Spotify or wherever. There's also another more complicated answer to that question, which goes back to what I said about the difference between sounding loud and metering loud. There's a whole load of things that go into making something sound loud that don't really have anything to do with the way that it meters. So if you take a solo flute piece and you push the level up so that it's the same loudness as a heavy metal tune, it will still sound like a quiet, gentle flute piece. It'll just sound odd in comparison to the heavy metal song. Because our ears know that heavy metal is thrashing guitars and drums and screaming vocals. That's a loud sound. And our ears know that a flute is a gentle sound. So, things like saturation, compression, density, intensity, distortion, clipping, compression, heavy limiting, all this stuff contributes to making something sound loud before you ever start thinking about how it meters. And I think one thing that I would say is all of the streaming services, they're currently based around -14. The streaming the AES, I contributed to TD 1008, which is a set of recommendations for streaming services on how loud they should distribute music at, and we're recommending -16 for music and -18 for speech and mixed content. So if they follow that advice, then -14 will reduce to -16 in future. None of that has to affect the way that we master our music, because that's them. That's how loud are they going to distribute the music at. They want to even out loudness differences because it annoys users. Nobody likes being blasted by loud music. That's why they do it. The trick for us is to get it sounding good musically when they're making those changes. That doesn't mean we have to aim at their distribution loudness, whatever that might be. If you have an intense, heavy rock song and you master it at -14, see, now we're going to run into the problem with the integrated versus short term, right? Because actually, if the loudest bits are up at -10 and the quietest bits are down at -16, then -14 as an overall value might work absolutely fine. And I'll give you an example of a massive album that fits the bill perfectly for that, which is Fear Inoculum by Tool. It won the Dynamic Range Day Award a couple of years ago, mastered by Bob Ludwig. Nobody's going to tell you that's a quiet album, but overall it has an integrated loudness of -14 LUFS, which all kinds of people will tell you is way too quiet. And I would, no, because the numbers are much less important than the way that it sounds. But there are songs on it that are much louder than -14, and there are others that measure much lower. So my advice is to not concern yourself with that stuff at all. My rule of thumb is loud sections at -10 LUFS short term, and then balance everything musically from there. And what you will find if you master that is that the really loud stuff will come out about -10, the stuff that's loud all the way through. The quieter stuff will come out about -16, and other stuff will come out at -14. It's all good. It's all fine. Then you need to test it and say, okay, if this is going to be played on Spotify or YouTube or wherever, what's going to happen? And you can use the loudness penalty website that I set up with meter plugs, loudnesspenalty.com. You can drag the files on. They get measured in the browser. They're not uploaded, and it will tell you what's going to happen, and you can preview them. And then this is the key bit, you then compare them. The numbers don't matter so much as what it sounds like when it's been adjusted to that loudness. So if my song that I mastered at -10 is turned down by 4 dBs and plays back at -14, who cares? Except, how does it sound in comparison to other stuff that I want it to sound like when that's played at -14? And those are the kind of comparisons you want to make. So the other reason that people find things don't sound the way they expect when they hear them back on Spotify is sometimes that they've actually mastered them a bit quiet or at -14, and therefore they've used a bit less compression, a bit less clipping and saturation, all those other things that add to the impression of loudness that other albums are using to achieve those higher numbers. And so even when the loudness is matched out, you don't get that same feeling of intensity and all the rest of it. So, like I say, for me, the loudest songs I master might be -10. It's not often I go that high, -11, -10, which means they get turned down by 3 dBs or more on the streaming services. But providing when I compare them with other stuff at the same loudness, they sound good, I'm happy. I'm not concerned about that. So it's hard to talk about this stuff. There's more about that in the Mastering Essentials videos on the Sound of Sound website. There's more about that on the Mastering Show podcast and on my website, productionadvice.co.uk. And time for another plug. There's going to be more about that on the Home Mastering Masterclass course that I'm running, which starts this Friday. It's an 8-week course. Every week I master a different song using different gear, different plugins, using different strategies. There are interviews with the people who supplied the songs to me. There's a Facebook group where you can talk to other members and share songs and critiques, and there are Q&A sessions like this one, except you can actually join me on the call and we can have a conversation about questions you might have about the course and about the things that you want to achieve with your home mastering. So if you're interested in that, excuse me, you can get a discount if you sign up before Friday of £90 off the full price. It's a fantastic bargain. Head over to homemastering.com if you'd like to check that out. End of plug. Next question. Actually, I'll talk a little bit more. We were talking about streaming there. So where's the question? Jamie asked, what's the outlook on all the streaming services introducing album normalization? So album normalization, YouTube uses track normalization. Every video that gets uploaded gets normalized down to -14. They don't turn quiet stuff up. That's another reason that things might sound quiet on streaming services if they're not being turned up. YouTube doesn't turn things up, so everything gets turned down if it's louder than -14. That's known as track normalization. If you upload an album to YouTube, it's going to get messed up by that because the loud stuff's going to get turned down. So it's not going to sound as loud as you intended it. The solution to that is album normalization. It's tricky for YouTube to do album normalization because there aren't albums as such on YouTube. But they're clever. They might figure it out. Spotify, iTunes, and Tidal all have album modes. Spotify and iTunes will recognize if you're playing an album and retain the track by track relationship. So the whole album gets turned up or down, but it keeps the loud songs on an album loud. Spotify does the same thing, but neither of them do it when you're in shuffle mode. Tidal, on the other hand, does everything using album normalization. And I think this might be what Jamie was asking about. So they're still the only one to always use album normalization. You might think that's crazy. In shuffle mode, it should be track normalization. But actually, it turns out I took part in some research on this, and even when you're shuffling songs together, it sounds weird to have the loud stuff turned down to be similar to the quieter stuff. If instead you just take the loudest song on an album and use that as a number for the entire album, and then allow the songs to get shuffled up, even off different albums, it works much, much better. Again, it's not perfect, but it sounds much more musically convincing. So currently, Jamie, only Tidal are doing that, although iTunes and Spotify do have album mode. But again, the AES recommendations that I took contributed to, TD 1008, recommend that all the streaming services should switch to using album normalization all the time, and hopefully they will make that move and normalization will work even better. You know, it already works okay, but there's room for improvement, and we think that would be a big step forward if they did it. Okay, back to the live comments. FJ Music says hello. Ed is saying he's using Dropbox to share masters, but when I check mixes on AirPods by streaming from Dropbox on, say, an iPhone and iPad, the sound is modified by Apple's spatial effect. You can turn this feature off on your device, which I've done, but the effect is still there. So I guess we need to be very careful as clients may be hearing some affected version. Well, that's a fair point, but even more generally, I mean, Dropbox, if you send somebody a Dropbox link, you know, Dropbox, you can transfer the files. If they download it, they'll get exactly the file you sent. But if they click on a link and hear it in the browser, they're listening to, it's not even a very high quality MP3 version, basically. So yeah, we do have to be careful. I mean, I use Dropbox to share everything with people. People send me files using Dropbox and I send them masters back. Excuse me, but I send my masters out as DDP images. DDP stands for Disk Description Protocol. So it's a format for producing CD masters, but it's kind of like it's like an image file basically of the entire disk with all of the metadata and everything else. You can't play it without a special player, and I zip things, so people can't preview them directly from Dropbox. You have to download them and use. I send a DDP player app to my clients. So yeah, the stuff that I send is not usually playable on Dropbox, but I agree, it's a bit of a can of worms, Ed, and it's going to get worse in future. We're going to have to keep an eye on it. And yes, Apple Spatial, I found that I had to get a new phone recently. My old one died, and I was listening to something and thinking, well, the panning is off. And then I realized that the spatial effect was on. And because I was looking over here, it had panned the music in my... So, there's all kinds of fun stuff that might be happening because of Apple Spatial and Dolby Atmos. But there's also more worms to wriggle around all over the place and confuse matters. Joe says, my mixes always seem to have too much energy in the upper mids. And if I'm happy with the overall tonal balance, I seem reluctant to adjust the tracks. So look to mastering to bring down the levels in this EQ area. What technique would you suggest first? EQ or banded compression or another technique? So this goes back to one of the first things I said, Joe. I always recommend EQ first, balanced EQ first, then dynamics. And the reason is, if you imagine something that's got a really pounding kick drum, pushing into a compressor, the compressor is going to react to that kick drum and it's going to duck, and you're going to hear, the whole mix pumping according to that kick drum. Now, if it's EDM, that might be what you want, but if it's rock, maybe not. Maybe a little bit, but but the point being, if you then EQ that low frequency energy out after the compressor, you can balance the EQ later in the chain, but the compression pumping will still be there. So if you're happy with that, it's all good, but if not, maybe not. Whereas if you balance the EQ before, then the compressor will be reacting more similarly to all the different frequency bands, all the different areas in the frequency spectrum. So you won't get that same degree of pumping, and you'll get a much more transparent, invisible result, which is always what I'm going for in mastering. My job is for people to not notice me, in my opinion. So yeah, I would always go in with EQ first, get the, I don't know, maybe 80% of the benefits of mastering of the EQ. It's a huge, the number of times I've been mastering something thinking, that's good, but it's not quite right. Maybe that's as good as it's going to get. And then I spend another 5 minutes tweaking the EQ and I suddenly find something and it all just, just that little notch or that little lift here or there just opens everything out or calms everything down or whatever it was I was looking for. It's amazing to me, even after all these years, what you can achieve with just EQ on a master. So I would always EQ first. Occasionally you want to use a dynamic EQ, but, I mean, even when I'm using multiband compression, it's more as a really invisible form of broadband compression rather than controlling specific frequency ranges. The more aggressive the processing gets on the mastering, the more I start to think, actually, it would probably be better to go back and fix this in the mix. Which is not to say I don't do those things. I'm quite happy to roll my sleeves up when necessary. But yeah, in general, the more sophisticated the processing gets, the more careful you need to be with it. That reminds me of another question that was sent before the stream started. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah. John asked, have you tried Bobcats's UAD Precision K Ambience Recovery plugin, which is a plugin that aims to enhance or recover stereo information from files that don't have much stereo going on? What are your thoughts on it and how best to use a tool like that? Do you use much mid-side processing when mastering? What kind of mid-side tools do you tend to use and under what circumstances do you choose to use them? Okay, so there's huge questions, John, but briefly, I haven't tried Bob's K Stereo plugin. I don't have any UAD gear, so I can't run them. There's a hardware version, but it's super expensive. I would like to. I'm sure it's very good. Bob is a fantastic engineer. has fantastic ears. If he's put his name on that processor, I would like to have it. I have once in my entire career used mid-side compression for something where there was some real extreme imbalances in the mix. It was a demo. It was the only version available. I wasn't really happy with the result. I think mid-side compression just messes with stuff too much for me in mastering. I use mid-side EQ quite a bit. You need to be careful, because we did a podcast episode on this. We've done 2 with Ian Stewart from Flowtown Mastering. Fantastic episodes, very deep and very nerdy. It's really sum and difference EQ or processing. So, people always say, oh, you can EQ the mids and the sides separately. Not true. You can to some extent, but it's much more complicated than that. But I do use it. It can be a nice way. For example, let's say somebody's got the classic chugging hard panned rock guitars left and right, but they've been low passed a bit aggressively, high passed. So they've had some of the lows taken out of them that you don't really want. It can be nice to go in with an EQ in the side channels and just beef those up a bit, push out some of the warmth and the chug in the kind of 500 Hertz region maybe, or 200 Hertz. Get some low end weight back into them without muddying up the bass and the vocal in the center of the image. That kind of thing can work quite nicely. It can also be a nice way of broadening out the stereo mix selectively. So I do that sometimes. I also use just a simple mid-side balancing plugin. Cubase Steinberg have one. It's just, it literally just, if you pull it all the way down to 0, it goes to mono. If you push it all the way up, it starts to sound really phasey and odd. That can be nice to just open things out a little bit sometimes. I use them maybe 1 in 10 masters, perhaps, that I do. Maybe 1 or 2 songs on an album, perhaps. And the times when I use it is just when when I'm feeling like everything is really clustered in the middle, or when there's something EQ'd somewhere that I want to affect differently. There's no hard and fast rules. Excuse me. So yeah. In terms of more advanced processing, I really like Leapwing Audio's Stage 1. They have 2 plugins that can affect that. That's more advanced. That's using kind of perceptual coding, the same stuff that's in Isotope's music rebalance tools, and some of this new stuff that's just coming to out in the last few years, using kind of AI tools to really do advanced processing on the music. They're using that to disentangle the center image from the side. You can get really creative. It's super powerful. They're Spider-Man plugins. With great power comes great responsibility. So yeah, that covers that. Let's see how many of these other questions. Toby, have you tried the Gullfoss EQ? I haven't. Any thoughts on intelligent processors like this? They're incredibly clever. There's one called Smart EQ that I tried. I'm too much of a control freak. I want to, and where's the fun in letting something else process my music to make it sound good? I want the glory. I want to know that I did that. I made that sound good. That's the appeal for me of mastering, is to be able to, have empathy for what the client is trying to achieve and help them get closer to their goal, and know that I contributed to that process. That's what makes it satisfying and enjoyable. So yeah, I don't use many things. Do I use any kind of automated processing in mastering? I don't think I do. I know there are some people who, will use a quick loudness normalization to get everything to minus 16 or something before they start mastering, just so that they've got a level ball. I just push the fader up. So yeah, in that sense, I'm old school. But they are amazing, all these new tools that are coming out, and super clever. And things like Isotope's music rebalance and the Leapwing processing and split EQ, and there's a few others that are just coming out now. That kind of advanced processing that just gives me more power. It's also exciting and interesting, but it's definitely getting to that territory where I feel like maybe it would be better done in the mix rather than the master. it's fun to kind of appear to be a magician to your clients, but it's not always doing the best. It's not always the best thing for them. Sometimes it would be better for you to say to them, well, here's what I've got. I think it might be even better if we could try this, if you want to do the experiment. And almost always when they do that, you get a result that's better. So hopefully that helps. I've answered those. Daniel had an interesting one. What are your conclusions after so many years mastering about psychoacoustic EQ and how the different bands affect each other? I mean, I notice how playing with adjacent bands makes sense, but also many times the very highs and the lowest lows. Any research about this? I'm not 100% sure I know what you mean, Daniel, but I think what I would say is to go back to, I think maybe you're talking about intelligent EQ a bit like the previous question, which is why I dropped that one in there. Or maybe you're asking about the reason it's important to get loudness right before you make an EQ adjustment is this thing called the equal loudness curve, or the Fletcher-Munson curve. So the louder sounds get, the more we perceive they have bass and treble. Nobody knows quite why, but it means if you EQ something at a low level and then turn it up, it's probably not going to sound right. So, and that for me is the interesting stuff about the psychoacoustics. So certainly if I'm mastering and I go in and I think, oh, this needs a little bit of 10K, and you add that little bit of air, and you sit and you go, okay, now that's better, but it needs a little bit more weight down the bottom to balance it. So, mastering an EQ for me is always about balance, not matching. You're not making this match that, or this the same as that, and it's about balancing things perfectly with each other so that they play off against each other and they work well together. An EQ is the same. If there's just something missing in the EQ response at a certain frequency and you put it back, you probably don't have to balance that because you're correcting an imbalance in the first place. But if you have something that basically sounds nice and you just think, I'd like a little bit more of this because it's going to sound good rather than because there was a problem, that's the kind of thing where you are likely to end up needing to trade things off and balance and keep them. So I don't know if I've understood your question, Daniel, so I won't spend too much more time on it, but I think a combination of those two factors, getting the loudness right, balancing the EQ, and then making your decisions about everything else. And just, yes, this idea that it's kind of for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, or at least there's something happens somewhere else. You have to retain, well, you don't have to retain balance, but you probably want to retain balance if you're aiming for a balanced result. If the result is deliberately to make something super subby and kind of muffled, that's a creative decision. But if you're trying to make something that's going to translate well to a wide range of systems, the average, the kind of center line of all of that wants to be balanced and kind of even frequency response. So hopefully that's helpful. Christopher asked if I had a go-to EQ and compressor. So one of the informal mottos of the Home Mastering Masterclass course, which starts this Friday and is an 8-week course where I master a load of stuff and show you how I do it, and you can get a £90 discount if you sign up this week. One of the unofficial mottos of that course is, it ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it. And I genuinely believe that, especially now. Any DAW will have stock tools within it that are good enough to make dramatic mastering improvements to your music. I do this when I go out and do talks at colleges. I'll do an hour-long mastering essentials talk, and then I do a workshop afterwards, and I just get students to bring stuff in on USB sticks. We plug it in, and on whatever they have there, usually a pair of Genelecs, and usually Logic running on a laptop, I will do mastering. It's not real mastering, of course. We're not in a mastering studio. We're not using mastering monitoring. We're not using mastering gear. But the process I've described, balancing the loudness, balancing the EQ, those two things can make a set of songs that sound like they're from different planets sound like they're intended to be together on a compilation album. And that's one of the things that mastering can do. It's so dramatic. And yeah, any digital EQ these days will help you do that. Any DAW is going to have a reasonably clean digital limiter. If you don't push it too hard, you'll be able to control the levels. It will have some decent compressors in it. some of them are really good, you know. So now, does that mean it's not nice to have racks of outboard gear and, you know, monitors worth more than a family car and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of room? No, absolutely not. It's great. And it makes life easier, and it lets you work more efficiently and more comfortably and all of that stuff. So my go-to processing changes. But back when I was working at the studio where I was trained and where I worked for 15 years, I had a TC Electronics System 6000. It was a hardware unit, but it was completely digital. It had amazing converters, had amazing processing on it. Then I left and the studio went bust and I couldn't use it anymore. But now you can get it as a plug-in. So something that cost tens of thousands of pounds back then is available for hundreds of pounds. So I really like FabFilter stuff. I use FabFilter a lot. I've been using it for ages, but I've been experimenting with the TC Electronic MD4 processing again and really enjoying using it. I just found it, you know, I can get great results. I used to really like the Chiswick Reach compressor, for example, for some masters. If you were talking about specific pieces of hardware, there are lots of people who, you know, use the Manley massive passive EQ and all the rest of it. I don't have... I was trained to work digitally in the box. I still like to work that way. I'm still completely happy to work that way, especially with the tools that are available these days. You know, I've used a ton of analog gear over the years, but, you know, the benefits of digital in terms of workflow, flexibility, recall, all this stuff are huge. And the processing is now out there at affordable prices to get great results. So it's much less important to me what you're using than how you use it and why you use it. And that's one of the things about the Masterclass course. One of the things that people always say to me is they really like the fact that I'm focusing on why. Why do you want to achieve this? How do you achieve it? And then what you use to do it is kind of irrelevant, or at least nowhere near as important as the rest of it. Yes, Christopher, I always master at the native sample rate of the audio, but I master in Wavelab. Wavelab has a really high quality real-time resampling module in there, so I actually listen at 1644. So with sample rate conversion in there, make all my decisions like that, then we'll check it at the higher specifications as well, and that means I can export it at higher sample rates and bit depths if I need to. But native processing at the original rate so that you can supply higher res files when clients want it. And so that it's minimal processing. The weirdest thing you've ever done in a master which worked like a charm. I once mastered an album that I had already also recorded and mixed for a jazz guitarist called Phil Robson. They really liked what the drummer was playing in one section on the cymbals, but nothing else was going on at that point. So we did a mad thing where we took the high frequencies of the cymbals from one version of the song, low cut filter it to take out all the low frequencies, and then added those cymbals on top of, I think maybe we just did it to the drum stem, thinking about it. We can't possibly have done that just to the raw mix. Also, I did an album of film music for Matt Johnson, who was in a band called The back in the 80s. And he said, have you got some kind of really dirty compression for this? And I said, well, no, not really. This is all mastering stuff. It's all super clean. We've got the Joe Meek compressor over there, but it's just mono. We can't process the stereo. And he said, can you not run the left and the right channel through separately? And I thought about it and thought, yeah, we can. So we ran the left out through this Joe Meek compressor, distorted the hell out of it, and then ran the right out through the same compressor in a separate pass. And of course, from a computer back to a computer, they all lined up. He loved it. That was a bit silly. I think that's all the questions that came in before. Oh, Paolo wanted to know, do I think the loudness war is finally over, and whether the resurgence of CD, vinyl, and even audio cassette have something to do with it? Sadly, Paolo, I don't think the loudness war is over at all. I do think CD and vinyl and cassette have an impact, but it's so prevalent. So much stuff is mastered so loud these days, just because that's what people assume has to be done. You know, it's kind of a default setting. that, I mean, maybe the war is, no, there are still people out there competing to be ridiculously loud. Except it is over because Dan Worrell has made the loudest track ever. If you don't know what I mean about that, just Google Dan Worrell, Worrall. I think his video is called "I Won the Loudness War." It's a really good watch. Philip says, how many questions? Whoa, we've got lots of questions. We're going to have to stop before we answer all of these, I'm afraid, guys. I'll just keep going through them in order and answer as many as I can. Right, let's go quick fire. Let's get as many as we can done in the next 20 minutes, and then we'll call it a night. Philip Tan, room treatment question. Are bookshelves capable of controlling low-end resonances, 150 hertz and lower, or do you really need bass traps for those frequencies? No, bookshelves are not really effective. If you had lots of different books at different kind of thicknesses, there might be a diffusion effect in there, and you'll get a little bit of broadband absorption, maybe, if there's lots of books in the room, but almost nothing will touch frequencies below 150 hertz. I mean, it's not 150 because it depends on the room. There's a critical cutoff frequency that I've forgotten the name of. But yeah, to control room modes in the really low frequencies, you need custom acoustic treatment is the short answer, Philip. Having said that, this room is not soundproofed. I can hear the birds through the windows when I'm mastering, which I like. And the bass gets out, you know, that's good because it's not in the room. I don't have to control it. That helps avoid a ton of problems at low frequencies. So if your room is not soundproofed, not keeping sound out and keeping sound in, then you may not need as much treatment as you might think at low frequencies. But bookshelves, not great. Nick says, how do I answer those that say LUFS doesn't matter when it comes to streaming services because they're just going to transcode into the format they want anyway? It does matter. If you master super loud and have lots of peak levels in the audio, those will be cleanly encoded by the streaming services, but then when they're decoded, lots of players will clip the result. So you get extra distortion that wasn't there on the way in. Also, the encoders find it harder to do a good job of getting a good encode with super loud material. You know, I mean, I talked before about the numbers are not as important as what does it sound like when it's balanced and what processing did you put in to get it there. You know, it's all about sounding loud, not measuring loud. So that stuff all still stands, but levels also matter in terms of the encoding and decoding. That will probably change in future as they improve the technology, but right now I'd still pay careful attention to that. Whitesey asks, isn't it a better idea to invest in sub-bass trapping of the room instead of getting a sub? I mean, it depends how low your speakers go. But yeah, I actually think, you know, I mean, a real mastering studio is going to be flat from 20 hertz up. And to really be sure you're doing absolutely the right thing at those low frequencies, you need to be able to hear that stuff. But a lot of speakers will give you something down to about 40, definitely, maybe even 30. It doesn't have to be flat for you to have a handle on that. And yes, I think, you know, the number of how many mixes have huge problems with resonances in the 50 to 200 hertz region, most. And mastering can improve on that. Having frequency response that goes down to 20 doesn't help you with that at all. But having acoustic treatment in the room so that you're hearing that stuff accurately and the decisions you make about that are good is absolutely crucial. So I think, you know, 80-20 rule, you get 80% of the benefit from 20% of the stuff. You know, forget about the 20 hertz stuff. Focus on getting your room sounding amazing between 40 hertz and 200 hertz. Well, across the whole frequency range, but definitely that bass range. In terms of the bang for the buck that you deliver to your clients or working on your own music is going to be way, way bigger. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. Bobeats want to say thanks for all the videos. Been following for years. My pleasure. Thank you for watching. There's one there in a language that I don't know. Sausage Fattener uses inbound to the comments. Everyone's welcome. Recently, I've encountered a lot of records with the novelty of being unmastered, like the Stephen Wilson remix of Aqualon. Is it cool to bypass the mastering? It is when your mixes are as good as Stephen Wilson's. Although actually, I mean, I love Stephen Wilson. I love what he does. The man's a genius. But some of his albums I would like to have mastered because I think they could have sounded even better. It's just my opinion. And they still sound fantastic, but, you know, being a mastering engineer is what you do. You listen to other people's stuff and you go, but it would be even better if you did this. Yeah, I think, you know, in theory, you get a master every so often that doesn't need any work doing. But in practice, how many albums are there like that? And how many are there actually where I bet Stephen Wilson goes through a mastering stage, even if he doesn't do any mastering process. You know, I mean, he mixed all this stuff, comes to the point where he's sequencing them for the album, all the rest of it. They are mastered. He's not going to a mastering engineer. He's not calling it mastering. And actually, he does get his stuff mastered as well. So, you know, there are exceptions. Iron Maiden did this, and they should have had years ago with an album. They're like, oh no, mastering engineers, we did it ourselves, and they should have had it mastered. You know, it depends. What's the material? Who's the mastering engineer? It depends. I'll stick to the the really classic answer. FJ says, my masterclass is brilliant. He's absolutely right. It starts on Friday. It's an 8-week online course. I master a ton of stuff and a ton of different DAWs. You can get £90 off this week only if you go to homemastering.com. If you're interested, check it out. There are Q&As in it, just like this one, except you get to talk to me one-to-one if you would like. It's amazing. Thanks, FJ. Tony is saying, I wish I'd known about this live stream. I'd have been here from the start. The replay is going to be available on Facebook and on YouTube. Just use the same link that you got here originally from. Once it's over, it might take a while for them to process it, but like from tomorrow, you'll be able to watch the whole thing. Mastering for vinyl, any tips? Oh, huge topic. Yeah. Use a plant that has a dedicated cutting engineer. Always get test pressing. Ask for opinions from other people about where they've had great results. Don't worry about monoing the bass. The cutting engineer will handle it if it needs to be handled, and it probably doesn't need to be. Don't limit or clip really heavily because it will make the master sound worse. Do all your mastering as though it's going to be released on vinyl, and you'll be in great shape. Seriously, that's one of the conclusions of the series of videos, the Mastering Essentials videos that I did for Sound on Sound, that I talked about at the beginning of this live stream, that you might like to check out. I've mastered a ton of stuff. I'm not a cutting engineer. I've never cut vinyl, but I've mastered a ton of stuff over the years that's gone to places like Abbey Road and Heathman's and all kinds of places, and I always get great feedback with them saying, oh yeah, we cut it flat. That tells me that my mastering, the stuff that I teach on the Home Mastering Masterclass course and in the Mastering Essentials videos and everywhere, is going to get you in great shape for any release format. Yeah, there's more on this. So if you go to themasteringshow.com and search for vinyl, we've done a couple of episodes where we've talked about this. There will probably be more in future. It's a big topic, but you need a cutting engineer. It's too risky to send your stuff. You know, even stuff that's been really well mastered may not cut. Every lathe is different. Every album is different. Every piece of vinyl is different. You need an engineer who's dedicated to make sure that everything's translating, even if it's just to take what somebody like me has done and gone, yeah, that's fine. You need that person there to kind of make sure everything's working well. Bring Me Sunshine says, the Home Mastering Masterclass is great. Too good for me, but it really helped open up my ears. Also recommend the Compressor and EQ courses. Thank you, Bring Me Sunshine, whose name I don't know. Okay, we're getting there. How would I get to a -5 LUFS master, avoiding distortion in the final result? For example, in drum and bass kind of music. If you go to productionadvice.co.uk and use the search there's a video there on how to make my master loud. The interesting thing about that is that the example song that I used, I was able to get it up to that kind of level and it sounded wrong without the distortion and the compression, right? So if you're going for a -5 result, which I don't recommend, but if you are, probably that density, distortion, compression, all that stuff is part of the sound that you're looking for. That's one answer. Another answer is you can't. There's no such thing as a free lunch. You know, the -10 short term that I recommended as a maximum level. The reason I recommend that is that, in my opinion, that's as loud as you can go without unacceptable trade-offs. You push past that, you're always going to lose something. You're going to lose space, you're going to lose clarity, you're going to add distortion, you're going to add pumping, you're going to lose life and vibrancy in the sound. Something is going to, it's a compromise. And you might feel that it's worth it. But in my experience, whenever you push past that, you always lose something. So, you know, there you can have master with less bass. You can, the internet is full of advice on how to get super loud like this. I just don't understand why you would want to bother. I mean, no, I do understand if you're mastering for clubs or, you know, in certain genres, I know, or for major labels, there's a ton of pressure. But you're asking the wrong guy, really. But take a look at that video. Actually, shall I just see if I can find it? It's a really old one. Is it going to turn up if I search for it? Because you search for loud on my site, you get a lot of hits because I talk about loudness a lot. Yeah, it's too much stuff. Let's just try Google. Okay, there's my blog post. And that links through to the video. Still top hit on Google for make a song loud, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so I'll post this there. You can have a look, see if that helps. Monkey Goat 76. I don't understand why we should even aim for a loudness target. Why not keep the full dynamic of the songs and let the listeners use their volume control? Well, fair question, but for me, there's a sweet spot. You know, we've talked a lot about being too loud. There's also such a thing as too dynamic. You know, you can for me, it's about balanced dynamics, balanced everything, right? Balanced dynamics. The perfect balance between loudness and dynamics so that it sounds dynamic, but it's controlled enough that it translates to the widest possible range of environments. I tend to mix with my monitor gain much louder than I do when I'm mastering, so that I don't have to worry about clipping or any of that kind of stuff, which means that my mixes are much more dynamic. When it gets to the mastering stage, if I just took those dynamic mixes and put them in order and ran them out, they wouldn't translate as well, especially to noisy environments like the car or all the rest of it. There are positive things that happen. Even when you look at some of the classic albums in history, they're not maxed out on dynamics. It's about getting the perfect balance, the right trade-off, so that it's dynamic enough that it conveys the emotion and the intensity without. Now, maybe that's what you mean. If you've achieved that already in your mix, then that's great. But I sometimes get people saying to me, "Oh, I recorded a mix this. I use no compression and no limiting at all, and I don't understand why it doesn't sound good." You know, that's not the right approach. You don't want to use no compression and no limit. You know, compression and dynamic management are at the very core of modern recording techniques. It's using them effectively to get the right creative result that is the key. So yeah, if the mixes sound perfect dynamically, you don't need to do anything else to them. But especially when you combine lots of different songs mixed together into an album, there are usually things that you want to do, at least to some of them. You know, some of them might go through absolutely perfectly, completely flat, untreated, and then there's others where okay, next to that song, or following on from this one, or at the end of this sequence of songs, suddenly it changes and I want to make some adjustments. So, but absolutely don't aim for targets, you know, especially not numbers. You know, having that rule of thumb, maybe the loudest section's at -10 and balance everything else musically, that works. I've been teaching that for 10 plus years. everybody says it works. I know it works. It works musically. It works in terms of streaming loudness. It works for vinyl, all the rest of it. But I couldn't tell you what following that rule of thumb will give you as a final loudness for your song, because it depends on the song. Don says, I have the Klanghelm meter. Yep, VU meter. The Klanghelm Vumped. Ladies and gentlemen, why would you not want a plugin called the Klanghelm Vumped? I can see that you guys are adding more comments. I'm not going to get all of those done but in the next 5 minutes. Pangineer, I'm learning electric bass. Are there any special considerations for mastering E-bass? Nope. Music is music. Bass is bass. I mean, yes, you know, it depends what you want it to sound like. But no, I couldn't give you any kind of rules of thumb specifically. How do you know when your job is done, says Tony, that the master is as good as it's going to get? That is, I would say, one of the key differences between a mastering engineer with 10 or 20 years experience and somebody who's starting out. You know, when I put a song on, within seconds, certainly minutes, I can kind of think to myself, okay, I'm going to be able to get this to the, you know, it starts off here, I can get it to this level in terms of quality, or I can get it to this level, or it's only ever going to be this, you know. But that's really hard to know in the early stages. So, you know, the first album I ever mastered as a trainee, it took me 2 days to master 12 songs, and I gave it to my mentor to see what he thought, and he said, no, do it again. So I spent another 2 days, and then a day tweaking, and then it was happy. He was happy, and then I moved on, and you know, that's how it goes. It's really hard. There's a law of diminishing returns. You know, an experience gets there. I think, you know, it's a question of, I think if you're fed up with it, it's done. I think if the deadline has arrived, it's done. I think if you've run out of money, it's done. I mean, you know, what's the expression? Mixes are never completed, they're only abandoned. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of practical things that go into this, but having said that, you know, like I said earlier on, I mentioned about, you know, oh, that final little tweak to the EQ and suddenly it makes all the difference. You don't want to give up too soon either. So, yeah, that's really hard to know. But when you find yourself going around in circles, you're done. You know, it's like, oh, it needs this, but then that, but then this, but then that, and you're kind of one thing up, 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. But when it sounds good to you in comparison to your reference at matched loudness, it's done. Maybe. Now there's, you guys are just chatting to each other, and that's good. What's my opinion of AI mastering software? It's fun. It's enjoyable. It's not mastering. It's just, you know, it's like the wizard tool in Photoshop, auto color balance. It's a quick and easy way to achieve a certain result, but it's not a human listening to this and going, what is the emotion of this song? How can I maximize it for the listener? There are people who say, oh, it will be one day. I have my doubts about that as well. Maybe it will. Yeah, Navi's saying, would an anechoic chamber be a good room for mixing or mastering? No, because it's so far divorced from a real, you know, my goal for a mastering room is that it should sound as good as possible whilst being similar to other rooms in the world. You know, it wants to be like the best living room listening situation anybody could ever have. But there's no point in mastering for anechoic chambers because nobody listens in anechoic chambers. Also, they're very uncomfortable places to be, and they sound very odd. I understand where you're coming from, Navi, but it kind of, if you didn't watch earlier in the stream, kind of rewind to when I'm talking about Second mastering room and the goals and things. There's kind of more of discussion on that. Pablo says, when it comes to EQ and mastering, I disable the spectrum analysis. It can be distracting. I think that's a good point. And in the studio where I was trained, there was no graphical representation of the EQ. It was a digital desk, but no graphics. And I had a 8-band EQ analyzer, just an old kind of bar style up and down, just a really crude representation of the overall frequency spectrum. And I think that's true. I mean, there was a question about ear training, you know, disabling the frequency analysis. You know, on the one hand, listening, seeing what it does, tying that in with your brain to how it sounds, that's all good. But on the other hand, just closing your eyes or turning that stuff off and just listening and doing things by instinct is also a great way to work. So, and that's a great point to stop, I think, because it's 11:30 and yeah, you know, that it's not about eyes, it's about ears, but using your eyes can be a great way to help train your ears. But in the end, it's all about how it sounds. That's a great place to finish a live stream on mastering. But also to remind you that the reason this happened is that this Friday, my home mastering masterclass course starts. So there's a new video every week, gets emailed to you, yours to download and keep, or I master a different song using different techniques, using different software, different strategies, you know, talk about mid-side EQ and multiband compression and mid-side processing and stem mastering and all these different topics. It starts simple, it gets more complicated. It's not, if you're completely new to mastering, I would say go off and watch the Sound on Sound videos first. And maybe come back and do the course next time I run it, because it's not really for beginners, but I do have there's a huge range of people who've done it. Some people have gone on to be professional mastering engineers. Some of them were professional mastering engineers and did it just to find out what I have to say on the topic. It's really good fun. There's a Facebook group where you can interact with other people on the course. There are Q&As exactly like this one. So if you enjoyed this and found this interesting, there's more of that in the Home Mastering Masterclass. You can ask your own questions and even chat to me live on the stream if you would like to. There's a bundle called the Max Bundle where you can get Home Mastering Compression and Home Mastering EQ courses thrown in for a 46% discount or something ridiculous. And yeah, if you sign up this week before Friday, you can get an extra £90 off the price that you're seeing on the website. Just go to homemastering.com for all the details. If you would like to do it, it would be great to see you there. Even if you wouldn't and you know somebody else who would like to, please tell them about it. Thank you for watching this evening. Thank you for the great questions. Great questions make for a great Q&A. And as always, thanks for listening.